A popular question asked by Fire Emblem fans less familiar with the franchise as a whole is, what's a good game to start with? Especially if you played only one or two of the modern games and are looking into getting into the pre-Awakening classics. There are numerous angles from which you could answer that, because Fire Emblem is a long and messy series of inconsistent quality and level of accessibility, with a fandom that is utterly incapable of agreeing on anything. Because you've read the title of this video, you know which game I'm going to be focusing on today, in honor of Nintendo apparently forgetting that there is, in fact, a second officially localized GBA Fire Emblem that they could stick on the NSO if they wanted. I guess there's technically time for another direct or two before the Switch is done. And truly, a large part of the legacy of Sacred Stones is that it's the most regularly overlooked title in the franchise that isn't a Japanese exclusive or remake of a Japanese exclusive. That was true back in 2005, when being released only a few months prior to Path of Radiance doomed it to relative obscurity almost from the beginning, and it's still essentially true today, when Magvel can be favored for some of Fire Emblem Heroes' most lucrative seasonal themes for years, and still have that barely register as a blip on the radar of players all too happy to get annoyed over any of the modern games that get too much exposure at once. And as I've suggested with the meme label here, there really aren't any superlatives that one could reasonably stick to Sacred Stones to allow it to stand out from the rest of the series. It's not the hardest game, nor the easiest. Its story is neither particularly deep and original, nor shallow and derivative. The cast is solid, but hasn't really had many big standouts in fandom. It's had no major shipping wars or controversial fan service elements, and its popularity is so modest and its gameplay so all-around decent even today that not many people are calling for it to be remade. Sacred Stones is, in just about every respect, as average a Fire Emblem game as it gets. And yet, it's still the one I would choose to recommend as an introduction to the classics. Obviously, it's not the most historically relevant, or one with a bunch of popular characters you're likely to recognize going in. But I believe that more than any of the alternatives, Sacred Stones strikes a balance between the clunky minimalism of the older games and the flashier, more streamlined modern entries. And I do mean that in a gameplay sense as well, even though if you're asking me about my opinions on this series, it's very likely that that's not the highest priority for you. There's no casual mode or turn rewinding here, of course, but FE8 is one of the only pre-Awakening games that provide repeatable battles for grinding up your units on a traversable world map. In general, Sacred Stones' design philosophy leans more on RPG mechanics and free-form unit building than any of the other localized classic games, something that it definitely shares with more modern entries. It wouldn't even be a stretch to say that the foundation for Awakening's gameplay comes predominantly from Sacred Stones, both in obvious choices like the return of the world map and monster enemies, and in subtler nods like the branching clash trees. Worth noting there as well, that even without reclassing, those branched promotions offer a limited degree of customization for most characters, and the mid-game route split gives FE8 a degree of replay value that's a bit harder to wrangle out of most of its counterparts. And while we're on the subject, here's a fun exercise for the comments. Go ahead and tell me which route of Sacred Stones you think is the more important or more quote-unquote canon route. Is there a right answer here? No. But fans did genuinely argue about that back in the day, because that's just what you do in a game with story branching. Later games have thoroughly demonstrated that route wank can get much, much worse if you give players enough incentive to get involved in it. So let's take a minute and enjoy some considerably more low-stakes discussion about which of Erica or Ephraim is the true lord of Magvel. Now that point of discourse aside, it is rather fascinating that of the two localized GBA Fire Emblem games, it's Blazing Blade that's more well-remembered among fans. Of course that's because it was the first one, but FE7 also has just about the most unconventional plot of any game in the franchise, which in combination with the tedious business of the forced tutorial that is Lin Normal Mode, makes it not a particularly good introduction to what players might expect of the classics nowadays. The story, and to some extent structure, of Sacred Stones, on the other hand, is as standard as it gets, and anyone who's played at least one of the modern games will instantly recognize certain familiar narrative markers. The lords lose their kingdom to an invading empire and have to go to war to take it back. There's dragons, there's a secret supernatural threat lurking behind the political one the whole time, there's incest subtext, all the usual Fire Emblem hallmarks. Shadows of Valentia especially sticks out as a successor piece to Sacred Stones, although that's predominantly in an oddly reciprocal way, as FE8 itself borrowed various gameplay elements as well as some of its two-lord structure from Gaiden. But I do think that painting this game as one of the series' several awkward middle children is doing its writing a bit of a disservice. The most evident standout is Leon, who's up there with Yggdral's Arvis as one of the most well-developed antagonists of the classic games. IS clearly agrees that he's considerably more sympathetic than comparable characters in other titles, given his abundance of heroes alts. But more than that, there's the vaguely Shakespearean tragedy that plays out between him and the Renee twins, born of his feelings of inadequacy as a ruler and his frustrated attraction toward whichever of the twins you choose to be the main one. You've heard of player-dependent sexuality in video games. What about root-dependent sexuality? That's only a slight exaggeration, by the way, even in spite of Sacred Stones being well within Fire Emblem's subtext-heavy era of gay writing. And it's something IS has certainly taken the opportunity to play with in later years. I don't mean to reduce Leon to his shipping dynamics, though. If anything, that's only one field where I appreciate Sacred Stones for not pulling its punches with regard to dramatic story beats. See also, for instance, the reveal that the game's resident conquering emperor was actually dead the whole time, or the general nastiness of Orson's motivation and how that's conveyed even as the worst of it is technically left off-screen. Sometimes, leaving something to the player's imagination really is more effective than simply showing it. What's more, I can think of a few aspects of Sacred Stone's writing that didn't stand out to me much back when I first played it in 2005, but that now do so a lot more on account of what some of the modern games have done with similar material. Ephraim is a character I had trouble appreciating back then, when I was basically stuck holding him up in comparison to Eliwood and Hector from Blazing Blade. But in the wake of later titles providing us with lords who are either even more bland and unremarkable, or take Ephraim's personal growth arc and homosocial relationships to even more interesting heights, I find myself enjoying him rather more. Erica, too, has benefited from the distance of hindsight, away from fandom's early impulse to go hard on her princess and knight dynamic with Seth, and more toward her capacity as a lord who genuinely tries to walk the walk with regard to avoiding war, however futile that may be when combat remains the central gameplay mechanic. She's got those story moments where everyone loves to dunk on her for grabbing the idiot ball, but honestly, I'd still take those over the way that the current series likes to undercut its female lords for the sake of either cinematic drama or self-insert pandering. And beyond the twins, and beyond still the other Magvel royals that have become just as overexposed in Heroes, there's little gems of characterization here and there throughout this game's notably small cast. Shout out to one of the more self-aware dancer portrayals in this series, or to a depiction of dragons that functions as a neat little microcosm of how Fire Emblem as a whole tends to handle them, compressed into just 2 characters. To one of the rare instances of comparative magical theory that touches on the game's religious world building, even if this game still makes the odd choice to never have any of its clerical characters from different countries ever speak to one another. That overall smaller scope is also to the benefit of newcomers jumping into Sacred Stones. It's the only fully self-contained classic Fire Emblem, such that you won't really be missing out on anything if this is your starting point. Magvel is, in essence, a sampler platter of Fire Emblem settings with all the expected highlights, and unlike a handful of others that reach for heavier themes and find inventive ways to trip over themselves by the end, FE8 can never really disappoint on that score because it gives exactly what it's advertising, and no more. And in spite of the route split, all but necessitating 2 playthroughs if you want to see everything, and even with the GBA support system artificially hindering the speed at which you can see everyone's conversations, it's the first game in the franchise where every character is recruitable within the same save file. FE8 is what I'd call a charmingly small game in contrast to just about every other Fire Emblem, with room for team and unit building variation, as well as a moderately engaging post-game, but also lacking the excess of choice that often plagues the modern games with their overabundance of skills, class options, and the dozen or so systems you need to grind out to see and do everything and engage. Seriously, I'll happily take the painfully slow GBA supports over the prospect of unlocking every single Bond conversation in that game. Sacred Stones is a throwback in the best sense, a happy medium between the really old, the only kind of old, and the new. Somewhat predictably, it's become lost in the shuffle as a result, to the point where I can kind of understand Nintendo not putting it out there as much as Blazing Blade. It's a game that certainly exists, lacking even the cult classic status of Yggdrasil or Tellius to bolster its modest fan following. In a time when we're all patiently waiting for IS to do something else with this franchise that isn't just the mobile gacha, is there any more appropriate game to lift up for the sake of giving it some much-needed attention? Magvel fans, do some uplifting of your own down in the comments, and let me know as well what you think of the idea of suggesting Sacred Stones as an introductory game for players just getting into classic Fire Emblem. As with the Root Wank, there's no correct answer to that question, but there surely are plenty of contradictory opinions. Be sure to like the video and subscribe as well. At the time I'm putting this together, I'm just on the threshold of my next subscriber milestone, so I'll be looking forward to commemorating that with you guys once I get there. Thanks for watching, everyone. Au revoir!